This week, the strongest signs yet that Donald Trump has run out of patience with Vladimir Putin. First, the promise to sell more weapons to Ukraine via NATO allies. And then a new 50-day deadline for peace. And it was reinforced by a threat of secondary tariffs that target countries that deal in Russian oil and gas. And finally, we had reports on multiple media outlets of a private phone call between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, in which he asked if he had the capacity to strike Moscow. So will all of this force Russia to the negotiating table? Or is the Kremlin safe in the knowledge that it has weeks more to wage its war without meaningful consequences? We'll be answering all of your questions this week with our expert panel.
I'm Vitali Shevchenko.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm James Waterhouse.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. This is Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Well, let's start with that 50-day deadline. A lot of you have got questions about it because it's something that can be viewed in lots of different ways. What are you hearing from Ukraine, James?
Well, at the moment, the delivery of Patriot missile systems is being welcomed. You know, what we're hearing is a relief, certainly from colleagues in Kyiv, that Donald Trump has finally announced concrete measures in support of Ukraine. But where we are now moving to is a sort of chasm in terms of detail. How many are going to be delivered and how? We saw that a top NATO commander this morning announced in Germany that Germany would be funding 2 of these things via America. But they couldn't say where or when these would be delivered. The German government was unable to provide that detail. I think if you're Ukraine, you've seen deadline after deadline set by the White House and missed, but we shouldn't brush over what is a notable sea change from across the Atlantic.
Because, Vitali, I had a sense interviewing people earlier in the week that there was a bit of frustration about this deadline. You know, great, another 50 days for Russia to continue with its summer offensive.
I'll give you one quote that I saw on Facebook from a Ukrainian commentator. And he said, the big American nothing is still that. Basically, so much ado about nothing, so much huffing and puffing, and still no fresh weapons deliveries to Ukraine. That's how it's seen in Ukraine. In Russia, I'll give another quote. There was a Russian senator, and he used this phrase. I've not heard it in Russian before. He said, all the steam has gone into the whistle. I imagine implying like a steam engine, but instead of turning the wheels, it's gone into the loud noises. And as we've discussed before, the Russian stock market rebounded after these deadlines and threats, because so far, Donald Trump's and his administration's actions, they have benefited Russia. The delays in weapons supplies, the lack of action as well, no fresh sanctions on Russia, that's benefiting Russia as well. So Donald Trump has bought himself some time, and Vladimir Putin as well.
Yeah, and on that, Olga, no extra concern then being expressed by the Kremlin over this deadline?
Not really, not that we've seen. But I think it's the time question is very important. Like, how long is it going to take to get all these weapons? And it usually does take quite a bit of time. And Moscow at the moment is playing the waiting game. And the longer they think the longer they can get, the more progress they can actually make on the front line.
When it comes to the time, Donald Trump was asked, okay, so are they being delivered? And he said, yeah, they're being delivered Patriot missiles from Germany, to which the German government spokesman said, well, I'm not aware of that.
We've had lots of questions about the weapons, as you can imagine, with these lines coming from Donald Trump about Washington's intention to send more to Ukraine, but via NATO allies. And this is a great question from Judy in Maidstone, who says, it's reported that France has said it will opt out of the NATO purchase of US arms for Ukraine. Is there a risk of other countries following suit and Ukraine not getting the weapons they need? James, what's the position of France here?
Well, I mean, Emmanuel Macron, like Germany, is grappling with a spending deficit in his government. He's grappling with an ageing population and struggling to get a budget signed off. So if you're dealing with those domestic issues, it is clearly why he is reluctant to commit to paying out billions of dollars for these American systems. So the NATO unit as a whole is just trying to get enough members on the same hymn sheet to be able to stump up the cash and meet the immediacy of Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine. Italy is set to follow suit. We understand that Netherlands, the UK, some Nordic countries are willing and able, but it just shows the difficulty in coordinating Ukraine's most immediate allies when it comes to vital weapons supplies.
Well, I'm sure many of you that are watching and listening will have seen those pictures of President Trump in the Oval Office again, having a good conversation with the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. We have a question from a listener on that very subject. Janet in the south of France wants to know a bit more about the former Dutch Prime Minister. And she says, I'd be very pleased to hear you talk more about Mark Rutte and NATO's position in relation to the Ukraine war. I feel that Rutte is very different to his predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg, and to my mind, worryingly so. James, we've listened to a lot of press conferences with Stoltenberg and Rutte in our time. Do you think that Janet should be worried about Mark Rutte?
I don't think so. I think they are two different beasts, aren't they? And I watched Jens Stoltenberg arrive in Kiev on countless occasions, certainly since the full-scale invasion, where he would say the same thing. Like a lot of European allies, they would say Ukraine's membership to NATO is irreversible, it's inevitable. He would talk about the need for Ukraine to be supported in order for Europe to be safe. NATO, whilst not letting Ukraine in the gang, is still clearly driven to help in any other way it can. I mean, Ukraine knows what it would like. But then, I mean, you've seen him in the flesh, Mark Rutte. He's got a bit of a a bit more of an obvious tactic that is different to Jens Stoltenberg, but nevertheless with the same message.
I mean, Stoltenberg is a very nice, very measured, very polite man. When I have interviewed him before, he's lovely to the people around him. He is very respectful, and there is a huge amount of respect for him.
Yeah.
Mark Rutte, it feels quite different when you're around him. He has a different kind of charisma, a different kind of energy. And I mean, he had all this criticism about how he treats President Trump, but it's worked. I mean, speaking to Gary O'Donoghue the other day, President Trump reaffirmed his commitment to NATO and to collective defence. So all of that kind of flattery that we've seen from Mark Rutte has worked. And when he speaks, I mean, when I was at the NATO summit in The Hague, people stop, people listen, the TV networks take him because he does have that kind of energy and charisma.
Yeah, well, there are two approaches to Trump, aren't there? One is playing up to his ego with flattery. The other one is pulling your resources together and telling him, well, look, what you're proposing is just not working.
I mean, are we missing a broader change here? You remember as little as a few months ago, we were talking about Europe, having to work out how to go on its own in terms of weapons supply and whether it would be in time for Ukraine. Are we now, with the tactics of Mr. Rutte, seeing a reversion to what was before, where actually, if you're given what Mr. Trump said recently to the BBC, are we now actually just getting America back on side? And will Europe as a bloc be as reliant on America as it was in the past, and will Ukraine be able to directly benefit?
Well, that is what so many people are hoping, and it's the frustration as well that President Trump is expressing towards Vladimir Putin that everyone is sort of honing in on.
There's certainly been a change in rhetoric. The only change of stance that I can detect at this stage is that Donald Trump is no longer opposed to weapons being delivered to Ukraine. However, he's sort of shifted the responsibility for keeping Ukraine supplied with weapons to others.
Yeah.
I think he's allowed others to buy weapons and then maybe pass some of those weapons on to Ukraine, which is different from what Biden did. We are going to give those weapons to Ukraine for free. And Donald Trump is proud of not paying a cent for those weapons going to Ukraine now.
But also you can never rule out the possibility of there being another shift.
Yes.
Later on.
With Donald Trump, you definitely can't. Let's pivot away from diplomacy now. We've got lots of questions to get through and talk about the situation on the ground because here's a really good question from Sasha.
Hi Ukrainecast, it's Sasha in Newbury. We hear when a drone and or missile attack happens on Ukrainian cities, but there hasn't been much news recently on the situation at the front lines. Is Russia still making small gains? Has there been any reclamation of territory by the Ukrainians? And what about Ukrainian incursions into Kursk and other Russian regions? Thanks.
Can you just bring us up to date, Olga? What's happening on the front line?
So we arguably are not talking a lot about the situation on the front line day to day, because if you look at the control maps, they just don't change that much day to day. But if you look at the wider situation over the past few months, then you can see changes. And arguably, they're not really that much in Ukraine's favor, because Kursk, with the Kursk incursion, they're pretty much out of Kursk. And in fact, the Russians are in Sumy at the moment, which is the region in the north that borders Kursk region in Russia. And it's not huge swathes of territory that they've taken there, but they are there. And Ukrainians have been trying to push back in their area. Then if you look at the east, the situation like in the east where a lot of the fighting has been going on, the Russians are still trying to take Pokrovsk. And, I've been talking about Pokrovsk for like well over a year now. But again, there, if you look at the wider trend, they have been taking territory, but it's like very grinding, slow progress. But as some of, if you follow Ukrainian soldiers like on social media, they very often say, but they are determined, they have the men, and they just keep pressing. And actually, yesterday, I was reading some comments from Ukrainian war bloggers that are in touch and are aware of the situation on the front line, and were saying that the situation in Bakrovsk is actually getting critical in their view, and it's getting really, really bad for Ukraine. But technically the front line is holding overall, but there are some things that are happening like very gradually that are technically not in Ukraine's favor.
Well, Sasha is right in that Russia's slow progress continues. It's slow, but it continues. But there may come a breaking point when Ukrainian defenses will crumble. And if you look at control of terrain maps, they are beginning to show pincers around Pokrovsk and around the neighboring town of Kostiantynivka. So if Russians slowly encircle and engulf those two towns, that's going to be pretty bad in very practical terms for Ukraine, and also in terms of morale as well.
And what do you hear, particularly on that, James, about morale amongst the soldiers on the front line?
I mean, we talk to guys that come back to Kyiv for respite, and the things they have seen and experienced and been forced to do, retrieve the bodies of dead friends, and then next thing they're back in Kyiv with their other male friends who haven't been called up. They might be exempt, or they might be waiting for the call. There's something Olga said there. The Russians are motivated. We heard something from a soldier. It's not a popular thing to say, where they said, look, the Russians took a particular square of territory. I said, they earned that. They have thrown everything at that. We've defended with our lives, and they have just kept coming in a kind of throwaway comment. And I think we must remind ourselves when we're talking about, yes, Trump perhaps having a little shift in stance. This is not weaponry that will allow Ukraine to counterattack, to liberate territory like we saw more than 3 years ago now. It is merely allowing it to hang on, to protect its people until Russia is pressured to pause in any way. But there is footage around Pokrovsk where you have a Russian armoured vehicle weaving through a road towards the front line, and it's like a vehicle graveyard. It just shows, the vehicle after vehicle that's routinely hit, but eventually, what soldiers will tell you, some get through. And then they're able to re-establish, and the front line collapses some more. And then you look at Bakhmut, which was captured by the Russians in 2023. A Russian was driving around filming there. It's a ghost town, and it is something that Moscow still tries to call liberation.
Do we ever see, or do you both ever see reports from Russian troops on the front line about what morale is like? Is it possible to sort of access any of that experience?
Not so much about morale. I think there are some fairly popular bloggers who are soldiers on the front line, And they can sometimes like disagree with the wider point of view about what Russians are doing, Ukrainians are doing. And occasionally they even say, oh, Ukrainians are actually, like, the drone operators are actually very good. They would acknowledge things like that. They don't tend to talk about morale. It's more about like operations and just we're keeping at it. We are now focusing on, because a lot of it is about like drone warfare at the moment. And there's just, we are focusing on taking out drone positions, taking out people, and they use also extremely derogatory language whenever it comes to Ukrainians. It's like, yeah, I can't even like repeat stuff they say.
Well, there is still a huge amount of interest when it comes to those North Korean soldiers who have been fighting alongside the Russian military, and that's inspired this next question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. It's Scott from Ohio. I was wondering, now that North Korea and Russia are working together openly, what would happen if Ukraine decided to hit one of the North Korean assets, let's say a troop-carrying ship or perhaps droning a factory on their territory? I appreciate it. Thanks.
I struggle to see how Ukraine would launch like a long-range drone strike into North Korea, because like the longest drone strikes we actually seen from Ukraine would be like somewhere in the area of Urals, so it's like not even halfway through to North Korea. So from that perspective, I think in order to strike something inside North Korea for Ukraine, there will have to be like some sort of operation like spiderweb of smuggling something into another country and then trying to hit assets there. But it's like the question is it really worth it? That kind of logistics, of the whole thing, because the spiderweb took years to put together. Is it really worth it? Are North Koreans actually contributing in terms of like ammunition or weapons as much as like the Russian plants and Russian production? It kind of, I think for Ukraine, arguably makes more sense to target militarily, to target industrial places in Russia that produce weapons rather than target North Koreans, who are largely supplying people.
We have a question now, which we received following our episode on Tuesday, in which we discussed an apparent increase in Ukrainian asylum applications that are being rejected by the UK. Don't forget, if you missed it, you can find that anytime by searching for Ukrainecast, wherever you get your podcasts. But let's have a listen to this question. It's from Mandy in the West Midlands, who asks, I've hosted several families and I'm about to host a family who were internally displaced in Ukraine since the start of the war, but found it hard to settle in a new city. My question is, are internally displaced people really able to settle in new areas, as it seems the Home Office thinks they can? And if the UK and other countries send back Ukrainians to safer places, surely it will cause problems for these cities. Thanks. I think we should remind people that this is based on current Home Office guidance, which deems some of Ukraine's western oblasts safe for return or internal relocation. I mean, Olga, this does depend on how we define safe, but what's it like in those western oblasts?
Yeah, I think it does really depend on what we describe as safe, because if you look statistically at the number of Russian attacks on western regions in Ukraine, and I'm basing off data provided by ACLED, which is a non-profit that tracks violent conflicts. If you look in the past 6 months, then there have been like 8 or 5 attacks in places like Lviv or Ternopil. So if you compare that to Kiev, which is over 100, and obviously it's way larger number for Kharkiv and other places that Russia has been targeting more consistently. So on paper, it feels like it's safer in the West, but then you still live there with air raid sirens that pretty much on a regular basis are launched across the country. So it's the mental health also toll that it takes. It's not just it's not just an attack and damage.
I mean, when you were in Kyiv, James, talking to people, did you look at these Western oblasts and think, oh yeah, they're safe?
There's no doubt there are distinctions that can be made because of the vastness of Ukraine. But I think first and foremost, we are talking about people's homes and the weight of this war that Olga mentions that is felt by absolutely everyone. And the UK government clearly is trying to act on those distinctions to try and control its own immigration levels. But the number of times we as a team have stood somewhere and thought, whether it's in the East, and said, how are people hanging on for this long? And thought, was their home? It is quite a thing to be forced from your home. It's quite another to be forced to go back to your country that isn't your home. So that is an argument saying you could resettle here. You could be 400 kilometres.
And we have to remember that while people are free to move from one Ukrainian city to another Ukrainian city, which may be, statistically speaking, safer, right? They will only do that. They will be doing that without any government support.
Yeah, and what about Mandy's question, Vitali? What kind of pressure does it put on those cities if you've got people moving in their families and relatives?
I'll put it this way,
as well?
upward pressure on housing prices. Yeah, house prices in places like Lviv, they shot up enormously. So if you're prepared to up your sticks and move from Zaporizhia to Lviv, be prepared to pay a lot of money. You'll have to find a new job. You'll have to start a new life. And contrast that with the possibility of moving abroad, where you would be provided with some sort of benefits and government assistance. And I'm not just talking about Britain here. Other countries are available. So that's why more than 5 million Ukrainians have chosen to move abroad rather than to places like Lviv, which are not as safe as Newbury or Manchester.
Last week we talked a little bit about internal politics inside Ukraine, and now we've had a reshuffle, James. Is this the first wartime reshuffle of any major significance that we've seen?
We've seen movers and shakers before, but I think, Rustem Umerov, he hasn't been in post for long, going from Defence Minister to the National Defence Council. But I think seeing a prominent woman, Sidorenko.
When you say prominent, I think...
Entirely disagree.
Well, she has relatively little experience, I would put it this way.
She's on the cabinet.
Yes. And the previous Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, called her Andriy Yermak in a skirt, which refers to this view that she's only doing the bidding for Andriy Yermak, the head of Volodymyr Zelensky's office. So this is the first wartime reshuffle of this magnitude.
Just, can we be clear, Vitali, who's new in post then? What are the significant changes?
The previous Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, he is being nominated for Defence Minister. So that's the key changes. But when it comes to Yulia Sviridenko, she has lots of experience in dealing with Ukraine's foreign partners. She was the one who worked really hard to prepare that minerals deal with America. So people in the States will know her. Maybe that will help. She was at some point Andriy Yermak's deputy as well. So some people, a lot of people in fact, are saying that this will only make it easier for the president's office to keep the government under control.
It is a concentration of power. I think you're right. I think we're moving furniture, but as this war drags on, Zelensky and Andriy Yermak, his all-powerful chief of staff, are consolidating their authority. And
briefly then, Olga, how is the Kremlin going to be viewing all of this?
Well, they will be loving it, because any consolidation of power, any like Zelensky looking more authoritarian or any infighting in Ukraine, it's a gift for the Kremlin, because they always, and the Russian state media always pick on it and present like, Ukraine is in chaos. Ukraine is no democratic state.
Another great discussion. Thank you all, and thank you all for your questions. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.